Thanks for listening to the Mornings with Carmen LaBerge podcast, made available thanks to support from listeners just like you.
Your daily encouragement that God has the world in the hollow of his hand. This is Mornings with Carmen LaBerge on Faith Radio.
If we're gonna fly, we fly like eagles, arms held wide. If we're gonna fear, we fear no evil. We will rise. By your power we will go. By your spirit we are bold. If we're gonna stand, we stand as giants. If we're gonna walk, we walk as lions.
Hello, hello, hello. Good morning. I'm Carmen LaBerge. You're listening to Mornings with Carmen here on the Faith Radio Network. Yesterday was Pie Day. Did you have some pie yesterday? Some pizza pie or some tasty, delicious quiche? What kind of pie did you have yesterday? It was Pie Day. You know, 3.14. Little nod to the mathematicians among us. Yesterday was Pie Day. Today, 3:15, is the Ides of March. The Ides of March, made famous by Shakespeare's take on the death of Roman Emperor Julius Caesar. The Ides of March is a day that is tied to, well, the prophecies, the betrayals, the politics of ancient Rome. And so on this Ides of March, arriving as it does each year with some proximity to the events of Holy Week and Easter, it always reminds me that Jesus lived in politically polarized times. I mean, if you think no one's ever lived in times more politically polarized than I'm living in, well, just look back to the Ides of March in the days of Jesus. Let's take a moment to talk about the politically polarized times in which Jesus lived. And I thought that maybe as a view to this, we could just talk about the politics of Easter. So the Romans ruled the day, and their brutality knew no limits. Crucifixion is about the worst possible way that you could die. The Jews had a nearly endless number of factions among themselves, including a group called the Zealots, who were essentially fomenting revolution. And so there was conflict between the Jews and the Romans, not just because the Romans were occupying the nation of Israel, but because among the Jews, there were all of these factions. And the Romans held some Jews responsible for keeping all of the other Jews, these factious groups, in order. So there were a number of Messiah figures wandering around in the Judean wilderness. There were divisions among the people as to when Messiah would come, from where he would come, toward what end he would come. Everyone in Jesus' day had an opinion about him as well. And those ideas were polarized. You know, who do people say that I am? Well, there's a long list and litany. Some thought he had come to bring peace. Others thought he had come to bring liberation through war. Some thought he would crush the Romans and set them up in positions of political power to rule a restored Davidic kingdom that would be centered in Jerusalem. Yeah, everyone was wrong. Pretty much everyone was wrong. Jesus was a king, but his kingdom was not of this world. Jesus was a politically polarizing figure on all sides, and he lived in politically polarized times. And he himself, well, he was the dividing line. Just consider the scene on Palm Sunday and the days that followed. You've got Jews lining the streets. You got Jesus riding into what had once been the center of power in the ancient Near East, Jerusalem. You've got people heralding Jesus to be the Messiah, literally the return of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. Literally, God, help us. That's what Hosanna means. God, help us. The religious leaders of the day were divided among themselves, but they were unified in their opposition to Jesus. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, on and on and on. They were all divided among themselves, but when it came to Jesus, yeah, they found a unity, didn't they? In less than a week, they were able to turn the crowd from shouts of Hosanna to shouts of crucify him, crucify him. That's political manipulation in a pretty powerful way. There were mock trials in both the Jewish courts and the Roman halls of so-called justice. There was the appeasement of the crowd's bloodlust when they called for Jesus to be crucified and Barabbas to be released. There was the public humiliation and torture of an innocent man on all sides. The rhetoric that was hurled with insults was just a part of how Jesus was publicly stripped of his dignity. Did anyone stand up for what was right? Did anyone take a stand against the political powers of the day? Yes. I would present today Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. And then I would also present the centurion or the centurions at the foot of the cross as people who were in particular positions of political power. Nicodemus, a Pharisee, Joseph of Arimathea, a Sadducee, and these Roman centurions or the Roman centurion at the foot of the cross, obviously a person in political position of power for the ruler of the day, which would be Rome. I want you to consider their testimonies and their stories. I want you to consider the personal capital that they expended to make very public faith statements and actions. Now, we don't actually know that any of them, Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, or the centurion at the foot of the cross, were what we would consider followers of Jesus. They're not among the disciples prior to these events of Jesus' death. And yet they are the ones whose faith is evidenced by their actions. I want you to think about that. Are you a person of faith because you say you are, or because of the public display of your faith, even in the midst of politically partisan or polarized times? The politics of Easter, they're not black and white and they're not red and blue. Jesus came not to unseat the Roman powers of his day or to ensure that a particular candidate would be elected in our day. Jesus isn't on the side of the donkey or the elephant. Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And he is the Lion of Judah who roars across eternity. In the days of Jesus and in our days today, crowds rage. That is the nature of a crowd. In one breath, they shout loud hosannas, and in the next breath, they call for crucifixion. You and I must stand outside of the crowd. We must walk with Jesus. Who wants to fit into a crowd that gets it wrong anyway? Don't you want to be found standing with the one who makes all things right? Don't play politics this Easter. Instead, consider sacrificing all you have to make your way with Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea to the cross, to the declaration of the centurion that surely this is the Son of God, to the grave where we might stand in resurrection hope at an empty tomb, where all the politics of the day are exposed. You're listening to Mornings with Carmen. I'm Carmen LaBerge, and this is Faith Radio. That music means that our brother Adam Holz is joining us from Focus on the Family's Plugged In. Good morning, good sir.
Good morning, Carmen. How are you?
I'm shiny. I'm shiny, man. I'm shiny this morning. How about you?
Well, if I'm happy, that would make us shiny, happy people, and that's pretty exciting.
There you go. For those of you that don't know, Plugged In is shining a light on a world of popular entertainment, seeking to give us as Christians and our families the tools that we need to understand and navigate the culture that we're living in. So what do you have today, Adam, in terms of reflections on the cultural event we call the Oscars?
Yeah, the Oscars, I felt, was a little bit muted this year. There are years in which It seems like every other person who gets up has, this angry political screed. And the very first winner this year, I'm blanking on her name, Divine. Well, she was with
I don't.
the movie The Holdovers. Forgive me.
You know, I didn't watch them, so this is like it is
Yes.
100% on. Yeah, whatever you got,
No,
whatever
no,
you
no,
got.
no, no. I got it. I was blanking on her name. It's Divine Joy Randolph. I wanted to get it right.
That's a fantastic name, by the way.
Yeah, in the
I mean,
first thing
who's
she
naming
said,
their kid Divine Joy? Like, I love that.
yeah, it's a great name.
All right, sorry, I digress.
No, that's all right. So the very first thing she said when she took the stage, and this is the first winner for Best Supporting Actress, she says, "God is good," and she's weeping. And then, I think she said, "God is so good," and then, "God is so good." She said it twice. And here's what I think is interesting about that. We often have celebrities that will give shout outs to God or Jesus. I'd like to thank God. I'd like to thank Jesus. And that's great. No criticism there. It feels a little bit different to me to talk about God's character. And so, I don't know. I thought it was a nice way. It felt a little bit more substantive. And again, I don't know what's in anybody's hearts. It's not my place to stand in judgment on how sincere people's shout outs to God are or aren't. But it felt very sincere. It felt very authentic. Obviously, Oppenheimer walked away the big winner on the night. Oppenheimer was, I think, a remarkable film in some ways. A lot of explicit content in others that would keep me from recommending that anybody see it. But for as much talk about, godlike power that the movie really delves into, in some ways, it's a product of our age. It felt very modernist to me, and that God is really not a part of the discussion other than Oppenheimer, quoting the Bhagavad Gita, saying, "I am become the destroyer of worlds." It's an interesting thing. And I think that we could also observe that among the Best Picture nominees, there was a lot of reflection on good and evil. And Zone of Interest was one of the nominees. It's a movie about a family that lives next to Auschwitz during World War II, and the father is actually the primary administrator of it. And the horror of the movie is that, as we know, unspeakably terrible things are happening in Auschwitz. This family is living almost a Leave It to Beaver kind of existence. I mean, it's just this idyllic, beautiful, loving family. And that's, I think, the commentary of this film is how could these things happen? Well, they happen because there's a disconnect somewhere, and we objectify people so deeply that we become incapable of seeing them as human beings. And so that, of all the movies this year at the Oscars, might be the one worth seeing. I believe it's PG-13. It's a hard movie. And it's almost a horror movie in its creepiness, watching this family, but very, very well done.
Your colleague, Paul Acey, had an interview with the director of Kung Fu Panda 4, Mike Mitchell. What did Paul uncover in that interview with Mike Mitchell?
Well, it was an interesting thing. Mike had some interesting things to say, even about how Poe, who is black and white and is kind of a hero,
because he's a panda, by the way.
Because he's a panda, Poe the panda, voiced by Jack Black. We see how there's this black and white understanding of heroes and villains. But then Mike goes on to basically say, you know what? That we try to categorize people as good and bad, but there are also shades of gray. Now I'm quoting, "I think there's shades of gray. I think no one's perfect. We're all imperfect people, and we shouldn't be so quick to judge." And so I think that that's a great message. And I also think that we also need to talk about, judge not lest you be judged, which is a phrase that lots of people usually those on the receiving end of judgment would say, Jesus said, don't make judgments. I think that we have to distinguish between the fact that Jesus said it's not our job or our responsibility to condemn other people, to make a final moral judgment about the character of their souls. But Jesus also said, and nobody quotes this passage, I believe it's in John, stop judging by mere appearances and make a right judgment. And, we see by their fruit you shall know them. And so we still do need to make a judgment, a discernment about people's actions. And we can still talk about right and wrong without necessarily condemning somebody's character. And I think sometimes that distinction gets really, really lost when people start saying, oh, Jesus said don't judge people, as if Jesus was morally agnostic, right? To the woman caught in adultery, he says, neither do I condemn you. And then what does he say? Go and leave your life of sin. It's grace and truth, right? So I'm a little bit far afield of where we started, but I think I agree with Mike. We all have, no one is perfect. We all have issues. We need to be careful not to condemn each other, but that doesn't mean we stop thinking about, the reflections of fruitfulness in our lives or not.
We're going to continue our conversation with Adam Holz here in just a moment from Focus on the Family's Plugged In. There's one particular movie that I want to know about. It's called One Life. If you got something you want to hear Adam talk about, you can text me, 877-933-2484. You are listening to Mornings with Carmen. Anne texted me, and then we had a conversation on the phone. She's 86 years old, and her husband, Bob, is 96. She listens to the podcast every single day, and she gets a lot of encouragement for her walk of faith in the midst of a life that has grown difficult and weary in many ways. Anne has a Faith Radio story, and so do you. If Faith Radio is a part of your daily journey with God, we'd love to hear your story. Share how God is using Faith Radio to encourage you and help you grow at myfaithradio.com. And who knows, maybe Anne will hear your story and be encouraged as well. All right, lots of headlines out there related to Angel Studios right now in relationship to The Chosen and other things. Those of you that are asking on the text line, hey, what about Cabrini? We actually talked about Cabrini last week. That is an Angel Studios production as well, getting really incredible acclaim from not only audiences but critics alike, and so that is pretty awesome. Yes. Hats off to Cabrini. Go see it if you haven't already. Definitely. Let's talk about One Life, Adam. What is the movie One Life about, and what's your review of it?
This is a movie that's in theaters this weekend. It's rated PG, and it stars Anthony Hopkins, who, when he's not playing Hannibal Lecter, is generally pretty lovely to watch on screen. He plays a guy named Nicky Winton, and this is based on a true story. The story actually alternates between 1938 and 1987, and it starts off in 1987, and Nicky's kind of a pack rat, and his wife wants him to clean the house up, and she goes out for a while, and he finds this folder full of information that is obviously very precious to him. And then we flash back to 1938, and obviously this isn't Anthony Hopkins at this point, but another actor. And it turns out when the Nazis were on the verge of invading Czechoslovakia in 1938, there was a surge of refugees, many of them children, and Nicky's heart was really moved that he had to do something. And so he actually flies to Czechoslovakia, or travels there, I don't know if he flew, to help oversee getting as many of these kids to England for safety as he possibly could. And we learned later that it was a pretty big number. It was in the hundreds that he helped save. And then, of course, Hitler invades, and World War II is right around the corner. Many of those kids were Jewish. Many of them would have ended up in a concentration camp. And this is almost like a Schindler's List light. We see his reflections on his passion to save as many as possible. And even in 1987, instead of being able to, have a sense of satisfaction that he helped save hundreds of kids, he just laments that he couldn't save just one more life, which is where the title of the movie comes from. And then we see some things happen in 1987 that connect him with some of the survivors, and he's able to see the longitudinal impact of his life in a really powerful and moving way. This is the rare mainstream movie, Carmen, I would say. It's just a beautiful story. And other than some references to, what happened in World War II and just a smattering of profanity, it's a PG movie. There's really not much content here. And I think it could be an excellent sort of discussion starter for what one person can do, the dignity of life, how to act courageously on behalf of others. Really lovely movie. And unlike Schindler's List, which is a remarkable movie, Schindler's List is rated R because the camera doesn't look away from anything. And so Schindler's List is not a movie for everybody to watch. But I think this one gets at some of the same themes and is deeply, deeply redemptive.
And really timely. Really timely. Yeah, some of absolutely. Some of the things that are quoted, like, why does England want all these Jews? Or what you note about, a letter that comes in the midst of the donations that reads, refugees go home. This is very, very timely in terms of the Holocaust, of anti-Semitism, of language related to the Jews. It's really, really timely. So I can't more highly recommend One Life, and Focus on the Families Plugged In here with Adam Holz recommends it as well. All right, we have time for one more. What do you think? Arthur the King?
Yeah, let's talk about Arthur the King.
Go ahead, man. Arthur the King.
So this is a dog movie. It stars Mark Wahlberg. He plays
Yay for dogs!
Yes, and the dog story here is lovely. Mark Wahlberg plays Michael Light. He is an adventure racers. Think like Amazing Race meets cross country, and you'll be in the ballpark. These are professional racers who have to get from point A to point B, and they have to stop in at certain checkpoints along the way, but the route they pick is up to them. And this particular story revolves around a race, I believe it was in 2015, 2018. And Michael has lost his last race in 2015. He's done this for decades. He wants to try one more time to win. So he puts this team together. They are in the Dominican Republic. They have to cross 435 miles of dense jungle and humidity and spiders and dirt and everything that comes with it. Sometimes they're running, sometimes they're in kayaks, sometimes they're on bicycles, but they're constantly moving. So they cover 435 miles on foot, essentially, in 10 days. About halfway through, they're at a checkpoint, and Mark Wahlberg's character, Michael, tosses a meatball to a stray dog. And at the next checkpoint, which is like 200 miles later, the dog shows up. And the team is flabbergasted because it's been like Lord of the Rings, right? They've kayaked and ran and biked. And somehow this dog has tracked them. And the dog kind of adopts them. They kind of adopt the dog. They name him Arthur because they think he has a regal and king-like bearing. And the dog has some really important things in an anthropomorphic way to teach Mark Wahlberg about being a good human being. So this is a lovely movie with a big butt. Sorry, that sounded weird. I didn't mean to say it like that. There is something you need to know here. This feels like a 1970s Disney movie, except for the fact that Mark Wahlberg, whom I really like, can't stop swearing. And so there's a lot of profanity here, and like a lot for a PG-13 movie. It pushes the boundaries. And that's a disappointment. And I know anybody making a movie has to make a decision about how realistic they're going to make it. And I'm sure they would say, oh, it's gritty and authentic. But I felt like this is going to push an otherwise really terrific movie out of bounds for a lot of families that might otherwise have been interested. And there may be families who think, oh, cool dog movie, and go, and are really unpleasantly surprised by that language too. So I don't know. It feels like it's a disappointment in that sense, even though the movie itself is pretty great.
Yeah. All right. So there's a language rating here that we want to lift up, but otherwise, Arthur the King is a compelling story for sure. All right, Adam, we got to leave it right there. Thanks, man. We love you. We appreciate you. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Carmen. Likewise.
Check out all the reviews at Focus on the Family's pluggedin.com. And yes, there's a ton there about other things that are happening, and read the blog, and yeah, on and on and on. Such good things. All right. So if you were going to write your memoir, first of all, you may not be old enough to do that. Enough life may not have passed. If you're super young, don't write a memoir. That's a silly thing to do. But if you have reached a certain age and you've thought to yourself, I might write a memoir, what would it be called? So title your memoir. That's what I want you to do. Title your memoir. You can text me 877-933-2484. What would the title of your memoir be? Marvin Olasky has reached the point where he thought, you know what? I'm old enough to write a memoir. His is called Pivot Points: Adventures on the Road to Christian Contentment. Pivot Points. What would your memoir be called? Maybe Sliding Doors, maybe Challenges of Faith. I don't know. Just think about what your memoir would be called and what might be included in it. We're going to talk with Marvin Olasky next about his pivot points along the adventure on a road to Christian contentment. That's up next here on Mornings with Carmen. All right, some of you are playing along with me today. Bob Castro's memoir would be Do You Trust God or Not? Walt Dorman has checked in. His memoir would be Redeemed. Love Lifted Me. Paul Perot is checking in. His memoir title would be An Enigma Wrapped Up in an Anomaly. Yes. Marvin Olasky is joining us now with a real memoir, with a real title, Pivot Points: Adventures on the Road to Christian Contentment, a memoir. Marvin, welcome back to Mornings with Carmen.
Good morning. Glad to be with you.
I haven't written a memoir yet. We got another friend on here who says, I have written 27 essays. I'm going to call my memoir Warrior Saint. There you go. I like it. I like the way people are thinking about this. Marvin, why is your memoir entitled Pivot Points?
Well, God throws challenges at us that prompt changes of direction. So I wanted to write about those and indicate that we shouldn't fear them. But actually, thinking about the titles you're suggesting, I could have called this book Long Shots. I've worked on some local church and school causes that succeeded, but then some big national ones like reforming journalism or advancing compassionate conservatism. Those did not make it, but that's all part of trying and learning.
Yeah, I really like it. I like the way also the subtitle captures the essence of what you're doing. Like, this is an adventure. There's a journey here, and it is headed in a particular direction toward a particular end, and that is Christian contentment. Talk either about the journey nature of this or Christian contentment as the point of arrival.
Well, the journey part of it is really important to keep in mind. In other words, one thing I think it's helpful for people, where would I like to be at the end of the journey? Thinking of people in the 20s, looking back, let's say, imagine that you are then 70 years old. What would you be proud of? What wouldn't you be proud of? And I suspect if people thought about that, maybe a lot of things, including adulterous behavior, would change. So thinking of the journey and thinking of where you want to be at the end is really important.
That's really good. All right, Margaret or Peggy is checking in. Perseverance of a Saint. I like that. The power of the Savior. I like that. I like the way we've got people thinking about what they would entitle their own memoir if they were to write one. That is excellent. I felt like this book could be called Moments of Truth or Crisis Moments. You have also acknowledged it could be called Long Shots. the change of direction at some pivot points is relatively minor. Like, right, there are these relatively minor pivot points that you might address, but some of these are quite major. When you think about the particular points along life's way that we really, not only do we discover ourselves, but we then become something because of a particular direction that we chose. Can you think of one of these pivot points where, after that, you were really known differently than you had been known prior to it?
Well, the one that really turned me around was a long time ago, about 50 years ago. I grew up Judaism, and then atheism, and then communism. This was during the Vietnam War years, way back then. And I actually was, I'm sad to say, a member of the Communist Party USA. That was difficult. I actually enjoyed being a member, and then God revealed himself to me. I was no longer an atheist, so I left the Communist Party. So that was almost 180-degree turn, going from communism to Christianity. I'm very glad that God worked on me that way.
Yeah, that is maybe the most major pivot point, because it is the one that then begins to influence every other one. That is the pivot point that Mindy Bells points out in the foreword of the book. I just love her, and I appreciated that she shared this part of your story, and then you retell it later. Even as you became a nationally respected journalist, political advisor, and scholar, she says, you never forgot the stumbling grad student inside who plucked from his cardboard shelf a New Testament in Russian and watched God transform his life. Could you take us to that time and place and moment?
Well, sure. And this is one reason I tend to think and understand that God is sovereign, God is in charge. After I came to believe vaguely in a God of some kind, well, what kind? I didn't look very hard, because I was in Ann Arbor, a college town with all the pleasures and problems of being in such an environment. So I was in no hurry to change. I wasn't looking, I wasn't searching. But to get a PhD, you have to have a good reading knowledge of a foreign language. I had forgotten my childhood Hebrew. My high school French was never very good. I had learned some Russian going on a freighter across the Pacific and traveling in the Soviet Union. So I continued with Russian. And one night in my room, I looked through my bookcase. Was there anything I could read in Russian just for practice? And I had a copy of the New Testament in Russian that a person had given me 2 years before. I just never threw away books. I still had it, and picked it up just for reading practice, and started reading, starting in the Gospel of Matthew. And by the time I got to the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5, 6, and 7, I thought, wow, this is something special. This isn't just for man. This is from God. I mean, for example, when I was a communist, I didn't believe in just an eye for an eye. I believed in 2 eyes for an eye. And then I'm reading from Jesus saying, turn the other cheek, love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, that to me was radical and pushed me in that direction. But again, it wasn't my goal to do that. It was just getting some practice in Russian. I'll tell you one more story. As a graduate student, you have to teach a class, and you have to teach what people assign you to do. None of the regular professors at the University of Michigan wanted to teach a course in early American literature, because that's largely Puritan sermons. So I was assigned to do it. I had never studied it. So in the summer, I had to give myself a crash course in reading the Puritans. And these long dead white males from 300 or so years ago were preaching to me. I'll tell you, I had grown up thinking that Christians were kind of stupid people who worship Christmas trees. You can love the Puritans, you can hate the Puritans, but you can't call these guys stupid. They were very thoughtful, very smart, and they impressed me.
That's so good. And it takes something to impress you. That is not lost on me as well. We're talking with Marvin Olasky. He is, among other things, now the author of Pivot Points, Adventures on the Road to Christian Contentment, a memoir. What is contentment? What does it mean to have arrived at a place of Christian contentment?
It means in this society where a lot of us are trained to think in terms of, well, I have a grievance. I haven't been treated fairly. All those types of things we tend to say to each other means, well, going beyond those and recognizing that God is good and generous, has given us all these gifts. And rather than thinking of ourselves as victims, we should be glad for what he gives us. And then perhaps aspire to more, but still contentment, not feeling that you have been cheated. And that's something I have three of my grandchildren with us right now, and they like to feel grievances at times. And I don't want to just say to them, grow up, but I do want to say to them and try and indicate them, believe in Jesus and reckon all the good gifts you have rather than thinking about what you may think you don't have. So God has blessed me with 48 years of marriage, 4 children, 6 grandchildren at this point. I had 29 years editing World Magazine, and joyfully just about all of that doing it. So all these things that God has given me are good gifts, and I may feel in one particular situation, oh, I haven't been treated fairly or something like that. Well, contentment means overwhelming any feelings like that with a sense of God is good and God has been good to me.
One of the things that I deeply appreciate about you and your work, I'm thinking this is the late 80s and early 1990s, because that's when I was sort of in the midst of seeking to understand what a Christian worldview is and how I was going to understand the world. That's when you were editing Turning Point, a Christian worldview declaration series with Herb Schlossberg. Mm-hmm. I just, of all the things that you've done, I mean, there are so many that I could point to and say, for this, I am so deeply appreciative. But I point to that because for me, it was so formative. You have written and edited so many things over the course of time. When we come back, could you lift up one that you say to yourself, you know, among all of the things that I've written or edited, this one stands out in my memory as a particularly special experience. Could we do that?
Sure.
All right. We're talking with Marvin Olasky. He has this just rich, incredible history, and much of it is in journalism and in writing and in editing. He is the person that I would point to as having helped us understand what it means to be a compassionate conservative over the course of time. And he comes to us today with Pivot Points, which is his memoir, Adventures on the Road to Christian Contentment. But I'm going to press him to talk about some other things as well. You're listening to Mornings with Carmen. Receive a daily email featuring a scripture graphic. Sign up for the Verse of the Day email at myfaithradio.com. We're talking with Marvin Olasky. I could read so many things that Marvin has done and in which he has been engaged. He continues to write and serve. You can check out what he's doing right now at Zenger House, ZENGER house.com, or also at acton.org. He's joining us today with his memoir, Pivot Points, Adventures on the Road to Christian Contentment. Marvin, I'm wondering, of all of the things that you've written and done over the course of a lifetime, is there something that stands out in your mind this morning as like, you know, that's the thing. That's the thing I want to be known for?
Well, there are three, and I'll go through these really quickly. Number one, compassionate conservatism. Actually, did a book by that name, wrote a book on history called The Tragedy of American Compassion. And that's important to me and I think relevant today because we saw the growth of compassionate conservatism during the 1990s and the early 2000s. These days, we probably have more of a cruel conservatism, I have to say. So that, I think, is important in trying to help people think about poverty in biblical ways and helping others. Second, wrote a book called Reforming Journalism, and that's been a major project of just about my whole life in journalism. So that's important. And you mentioned, I'm thankful you mentioned Zenger House, ZENGER. We give out, and we'll be giving out at the end of this month, prizes for street level journalism, people doing hard reporting. So if people are interested in that, go to zengerhouse.com. And that's been a thing for a long time. And then third, um, I mean, this book, this book, Pivot Points, um, it's current on my mind. It just came out a couple of days ago. But the book that led into it is a book called Lament for a Father. And what I found is that lots of people, men especially, but women too, have difficulties with their fathers, had difficulties, and sometimes that's still preying on their minds. So that book actually turned out to be very useful. Lament for a Father, for people who had difficulties with their father and trying to come to grips with what God did in the lives of parents and themselves.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that. I think that there are ways in which your story is told in Reforming Journalism and in Lament for a Father that both lay the groundwork for this book that you bring us today. And that's probably true of all your writing. I mean, we give a portion of ourselves away every time I think we write. When you talk about street level journalism, I'm so thankful that you pointed to that. For those of you listening and you're saying, well, what other kind is there? There is what we would call suite level opining, and that is not journalism. And so that's the distinction that Marvin is making there. In case you were wondering, we're going to give out prizes through Zinger House for street level journalism. Well, what other kind is there? Yes, there would be that suite level kind of opining that is not journalism at all. Marvin, as since we've got you here and I can point to anything and ask you to talk about it because that's, one of the joys of a conversation. You wanted to be a journalist from a very early age, but you had an early disappointment in relationship to journalism. You were not elected to serve as the editor of your high school newspaper. Now, that is just tragic to even consider now, but you were called what you call it a consolation prize. You were the editor-in-chief of the yearbook. You expected a lot from your senior yearbook at Newton High School. Could you tell us about that?
Oh, this goes way back to a time where yearbooks, and it may still be true, yearbooks are sentimental. I mean, they have pictures of people write their names on it, all this type of stuff. This yearbook was a little different. 1968. High school, probably the peak of Vietnam War protests over that year and the next several years. So it was a book full of mourning, existential angst, all an unusual yearbook, which I still have and look at it. Not really a happy book, but a sad yearbook. And I think that reflected a lot of the mood of that time. And I don't really recommend that to yearbook editors, but it was interesting to do.
Well, and it got me thinking, people still have a copy of the yearbook, as you note, you do as well. And maybe no one has a copy of those newspapers. So there you have
That's
it.
true.
There you have it.
Yep. Yep.
All right. Now I'm going to ask you the wizened sage question. What would you have us do? Maybe for those of us who are in that, what you describe in the book as, the busiest years. For those of us in the busiest years, what would you have us do as people of integrity and faith in the world today? Which direction would you point us when we arrive at a pivot point?
Well, I'd say two things. Number one, what's our purpose in life? There's an old statement to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And if you keep that in mind, you're going to do some things and you're not going to do other things. I'd also suggest think as best you can, and this is very hard for people in the 20s, think when you're old, what will you be proud of? What won't you be proud of? That I think would also change a lot of behavior. And then third, if you're earning a good salary, tithe and be determined in that, but also don't spend as much as you can. Save some money, because if you have a little bit of money in savings, that gives you liberty to leave a position if you're asked to do things unethically, and you're not going to starve or have your family starve in that point. So giving in terms of tithing, but also saving some money, I think is very useful to give us the flexibility to pivot perhaps in a different direction if that's what God calls us to.
You have evidenced there just how integrated your thinking is in terms of your Christian worldview. And so thank you for being a person who has been thoroughly saturated with the gospel. Thank you for that. Thank you for being a person of integrity at every turn. Thank you for living a life that provides an exemplar for others. I just want to thank you for all of that, even as we part company today.
Well, thank you. That's very kind, but it's all God, all God's grace.
Amen. Amen. That's Marvin Olasky. I commend to you his latest book, Pivot Points, Adventures on the Road to Christian Contentment. It is a memoir. For those of you who just recognize that you have a deep father wound, I would recommend to you his prior work, Lament for a Father. And for those of you who want an example of what we're talking about, when we talk about street level journalism, we talk about really telling the true story of what's happening. We had a conversation about a year ago about the story of abortion in America. And that is the kind of street level journalism that we're talking about, where you look at something over the scope of a period of time and really suss out the truth. So those are some of Marvin's recent works. Obviously, I commend everything he has written to you as well. All right, you are listening to Mornings with Carmen. We've got about a minute left here today. Yesterday was Pi Day, 3/14. Today is the Ides of March, 3/15, which makes tomorrow 3/16. Good News Day. So let the good news of the gospel not only permeate your heart and mind, but propel you into the day which now lies ahead. What would it look like for you to be a gospel person in the world? On 3/16, how will you go and tell the good news of the gospel, not only in speech, but in word, but in deed as well? Indeed, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. That's John 3:16. If you need a reminder today of why we talk about 3:16 as Good News Day, go reread and memorize and knit into your heart John 3:16. Indeed, it is for God who so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever would believe in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. Let's live the gospel out in redemptive ways in the culture today. It is Friday. There should have been a farm report. I'll just say it this way. It is spring. The flowers are up. The rain is falling. The grass is growing. Have a great weekend, and God bless. Thanks for listening to Mornings with Carmen LaBerge. Podcasts like this are available because of your support. If it's important to you to hear things that encourage your faith, click the link in the show notes to give now. And thanks.